His name was Rusty, or rather, he had no name at all. It was a name the neighborhood locals had silently given him, because his short, coarse fur had the color of old rust. Rusty wasn't just a cat. He was the spirit of the place, a phantom of dust and independence who would materialize in the alley between Tony's Pizzeria and Arthur Pendleton's antique shop. He was the untouchable king of his tiny kingdom of trash cans and cardboard boxes. Any attempt to approach, to offer food from a hand, or, heaven forbid, to pet him, was met with a furious hiss and an instantaneous disappearance. Rusty trusted no one, and in that lay his strength. Behind the dusty glass of the antique shop, amidst clocks frozen in time and furniture draped in the tapestries of the past, sat Arthur Pendleton. At 72, he, too, felt a bit like an antique valuable to a few connoisseurs, but mostly forgotten and covered in dust. His world had shrunk to the creak of old floorboards and the melodic chime of the clocks, his only constant companions. The phone remained silent for weeks. His children had grown and moved to other countries, and the world outside the window roared ahead, leaving Arthur in his shop as a silent island in a raging ocean. Every day, at precisely noon, Arthur would watch Rusty. The cat was his secret entertainment, his private one-actor theater. He saw him chase away dogs with regal disdain, scale the fire escape with nimble grace, and sit upon a trash can as if it were a throne, surveying his domain. Arthur never tried to tame him. He respected the cat's wild, uncompromising freedom. In this cat, there was something Arthur himself had long since lost, the will to fight and a complete disregard for the opinions of others. Today was no exception. Rusty had managed a daring raid into the pizzeria's territory and emerged with a trophy, a still-warm chicken bone discarded by the cook. He carried his prize to a safe place, right to the doorstep of Arthur's shop, the one spot other animals seemed to avoid. Settling in, he sank his teeth into the meat with relish. It was a moment of triumph, but suddenly something went wrong. A sharp shard of bone lodged sideways in his throat. At first, Rusty didn't understand. He tried to swallow, but instead, a silent spasm racked his body. Air refused to enter his lungs. Panic, cold and clammy, shot through him. He leaped up, trying to cough, but no sound escaped his throat. The world narrowed to a single point, the desperate need for oxygen. His paws scrabbled against the old stone slabs. He thrashed his head, his body arching in a desperate, silent agony. Inside the shop, Arthur had dozed off in his armchair to the steady ticking of a grandfather clock. He was jolted from his slumber by a strange sound. Not a cry or a howl. It was a dull, scraping thud against his door. Rhythmic and desperate, with an irritated sigh, the old man rose. Probably kids messing around again. He walked slowly to the door, turned the heavy brass key, and pulled it open. What he saw made his heart stop. There on his doorstep, Rusty was convulsing. His eyes, usually full of wild, arrogant fury, were wide with pure primal terror. His body shuddered in its final attempts to draw a breath. He was no longer the king of the alley. He was just a living creature on the verge of death, and his gaze was a plea, understood without words. Arthur froze. All his instincts screamed, "Don't touch him. He's a wild animal. He'll tear your hands to shreds. He's sick." But his eyes were locked on the cat's. And in that frantic, fading gaze, Arthur suddenly saw something painfully familiar. An all-consuming, absolute loneliness in a moment of utter desperation. In that instant, it wasn't just an animal dying on his doorstep. It was a creature just as lonely as himself. Time, which had stood still for so long in his shop, suddenly lurched forward with ferocious speed. The seconds were draining away, taking the cat's life with them. Arthur's hands trembled, and his heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. He had to do something. Now, immediately. And Arthur Pendleton, a man almost forgotten by the world, stepped across his threshold to fight for a life that mattered to no one. In a fraction of a second, decades flashed through Arthur's mind. All his caution, his habit of detached observation, his fear of the outside world. It all evaporated in the face of this small, desperate struggle for life. He dropped to one knee, ignoring the protesting crunch in the old joint. His hands, accustomed to the fragility of porcelain and the smoothness of polished wood, reached for the knot of agonized flesh. The first touch was a shock. Rusty's body was hard as a rock, every muscle tensed to its limit. Even in his death throes, instinct took over. The cat tried to twist away, but he had no strength. Arthur held him firmly but gently, one hand on the chest to steady him, while the other, trembling, searched for the right spot. And then an image surfaced, distant, almost erased by time. A dusty gymnasium, 30 people in uncomfortable uniforms, and the loud voice of a first aid instructor. Arthur had taken the course after his son had choked on a hard candy as a child. The Heimlich maneuver. The instructor had boomed. For a person, like this. For an infant, like this. The principle is the same, a sharp thrust under the diaphragm to force the air from the lungs and dislodge the foreign object. Memory helpfully supplied the final phrase from that day, and remember, the same principle works on small animals. That was it, a chance. Arthur tightened his grip on the cat, lifting his hind leg so his head was pointed down. His fingers found the soft spot just below the rib cage. He took a deep breath, mustering all his resolve. The first thrust, sharp, strong, aimed upward. Rusty's body jerked, but nothing happened. Only a quiet, gurgling wheeze. "No!" Arthur screamed in his mind. The cat's panic was now his own, a wave of ice washing over him. He couldn't let him die. Not here, not now, not in his hands. He gathered his strength for a second thrust, more desperate, more forceful. He poured all his loneliness, all his unspent care into it. A thrust. And then, with a soft, wet sound, a tiny, sharp shard of chicken bone flew from Rusty's open mouth and clattered onto the stone slabs. In that same instant, Rusty went limp in his arms. The steel spring of wild fury became a boneless, damp rag. For a second, Arthur thought he was too late, that he had broken him. But then came a sound. A loud, ragged, rasping gasp, followed by a fit of convulsive coughing. It was the most beautiful, most vibrant sound Arthur had heard in many, many years. He gently lowered the cat to the ground. By all the laws of nature, by all the rules of their silent acquaintance, Rusty should have leaped up and vanished, melting into the alley's shadows forever. Arthur slowly uncurled his fingers, prepared for it. But the cat didn't run. He lay on his side, breathing heavily, and his wide, still shocked eyes were fixed on Arthur. The fury was gone. There was only exhaustion, astonishment, and something else. Something new. Something Arthur had never seen in those wild eyes. The minute stretched into an eternity. The alley, usually filled with subtle sounds, the hum of pizzeria refrigerators, the rustle of wind-blown newspapers, fell into absolute silence. In this stillness, there were only two beings. An old man on his knees, his heart still beating an anxious rhythm, and a cat on the stone slabs, relearning how to breathe. Arthur finally let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. His hand, which had just performed the impossible, hovered in the air. He wanted to touch the cat, to stroke the matted fur, to make sure this wasn't a dream. But he didn't dare. One wrong move could shatter this fragile, weightless moment born on the edge of life and death. Rusty didn't move, but his side rose and fell in a steady rhythm. His gaze, fixed on the old man's face, was no longer wild, but searching. His golden eyes held a look of bewilderment, as if his entire philosophy of survival, built on mistrust and flight, had just cracked. The one who had always been a threat, a human, had just given him back his breath. The paradox was too great for his feline mind to grasp. Carefully, trying not to make any sudden moves, Arthur got to his feet. His knee throbbed with a dull ache, but he barely noticed. Without taking his eyes off the cat, he backed away to his shop door and slipped inside. Rusty was left alone. Instinct, honed by years of street life, screamed, "Run! Now! Before he comes back!" but his body felt like lead, and his mind was still echoing with the memory of panic and the life-saving thrust. He didn't run. He waited. The shop door creaked open again. Arthur appeared on the threshold, holding in his trembling hands an antique porcelain saucer, the kind that had survived 2 wars and dozens of owners. In the saucer was clean, cool water. The old man slowly, almost ceremoniously, placed it on the ground just inches from the cat's nose. Then he took several steps back, leaning against the doorframe, giving him space. It was an offer, not a command, not a trap, just a saucer of water. Rusty turned his head. He looked first at the water, then back at Arthur. The gaze lasted for several seconds, but it contained a universe of questions. Then, slowly, with visible effort, he pushed himself up on his trembling front paws, crept to the saucer, and timidly dipped his tongue. The quiet, barely audible lapping of water was louder to Arthur than any orchestra. It was the sound of acceptance, the sound of a nascent trust. In that moment, the loneliness that had lived for decades in the old shop shrank and took a step back. The cat drank for a long time, greedily, regaining his strength. When he was finished, he simply lay back down, curled into a small, exhausted ball. Arthur knew he couldn't leave him here. The night would bring the cold and other, less friendly inhabitants of the alley. He went back into the shop and returned with an empty cardboard box that had once held antique books. He carefully lined the bottom with a soft velvet cloth he used for polishing silver. Placing the box next to the cat, he spoke his first words to him, his voice a near whisper. "Well now, fighter, let's go." And to his infinite astonishment, Rusty, the wild, untouchable king of the alley, looked at him, then slowly, on stiff legs, stepped into the box and settled onto the velvet lining. Arthur picked up the box. It was almost weightless, yet it felt like the most precious and fragile cargo he had ever held. He carried it inside, into the twilight peace of his shop, and with a slow, nearly inaudible click, turned the key in the lock. That sound, a motion he had made thousands of times, was different today. He wasn't locking the world out. He was locking a new, tiny world in. He walked past the silent witnesses of other people's lives, carved chests of drawers, tarnished mirrors, and chairs no one would ever sit on again. He carried the box to his inner sanctum, a small room behind the main hall. This was the heart of his loneliness, an old leather armchair, a desk cluttered with books on restoration, and a single lamp with a green shade that cast a warm, cozy light on the walls. Arthur gently placed the box on the floor next to his chair. Then he froze, overcome by a sudden uncertainty. Now what? All his life, he had dealt with things. Things were predictable. They didn't breathe. They didn't feel pain. They didn't look at you with a silent question in their eyes. From the box, 2 golden embers stared back at him, 2 pupils reflecting the light of his lamp. Rusty didn't move. He simply watched, absorbing the unfamiliar smells of old wood, wax, and dust. He must be hungry, Arthur thought. He went to his tiny kitchen, a nook with a hot plate and an old, humming refrigerator. He had no cat food. He'd never thought he would need it. He opened the fridge and saw the remains of his previous night's supper, half a baked chicken breast. The irony of it made him give a bitter smile. The very thing that had nearly killed the cat could now feed him. As if performing a sacred rite, Arthur minced the chicken into tiny pieces, removing every trace of bone and skin. He placed the meat on the same porcelain saucer and set it on the floor, a few feet from the box. He didn't push it closer. It was another invitation, another test of trust. A minute passed, then another. The silence was broken only by the chorus of ticking from a dozen clocks in the main hall. For Arthur, that ticking had always been the countdown of his own fading time. Tonight, he barely heard it. His entire being was focused on the small cardboard box. At last, Rusty's head emerged from the box. Slowly, very slowly, he climbed out. Every step was measured. He was like a sapper in a minefield. He approached the saucer. He sniffed the meat. Then he raised his head and looked at Arthur. It was a long, piercing gaze. He wasn't asking for permission. He was stating a fact. I am here. You are here. And I am accepting your offer. And they began to eat, neatly, without greed, but with a focus that suggested it was the most important meal of his life. Arthur sat in his chair, not daring to move, and felt something hard and cold inside him begin to melt. When the saucer was empty, Rusty didn't retreat to the box. He sat on the Persian rug, as frayed and old as Arthur himself, and began to groom himself meticulously. He licked his rusty fur, putting himself in order. Arthur knew from books, from documentaries, that cats only do this, where they feel completely safe. And in that moment, Arthur Pendleton realized the ticking of the clocks had changed. It no longer counted down the moments of solitude. It was counting the first moments of a new, shared life. In his antique shop, full of the ghosts of the past, something present had finally taken up residence. The next morning, Arthur woke not to the chiming of clocks, but to an unfamiliar quiet. He opened his eyes and lay still for a few seconds, listening. And then he realized he wasn't listening for ticking, but for breathing. He carefully turned his head. At the foot of his bed, on the old faded quilt, curled into a perfect orange crescent, slept Rusty. It was a violation of every conceivable boundary, a betrayal of all the laws of the street. But here, in the silence of the old room, it seemed the most natural thing in the world. Arthur watched the steadily rising and falling flank, the whiskers twitching in sleep, and felt a long-forgotten warmth spread through his soul. For the first time in years, he didn't want the morning to end. Thus began their days. It was a slow, delicate dance of getting to know one another. Rusty, growing bolder, began to explore his new kingdom. With a grace Arthur never knew he possessed, he leaped onto bookshelves, weaving between porcelain figurines with a surgeon's precision. He slept in the drawers of antique dressers, on stacks of yellowed newspapers, on the velvet seats of chairs, breathing in the scents of bygone eras. He was no longer the phantom of the alley, he was the guardian of the shop. Arthur talked to him, not as one would talk to a cat, but as an equal. He told him the stories of the objects that surrounded them. "These clocks, Rusty," he would whisper, polishing the glass. "They belonged to a sea captain. They counted time in storms off Cape Horn." The cat would sit nearby, listening to his quiet voice, and sometimes, in response, he would make a low, guttural sound. And one day, Arthur heard something that turned his world upside down. He was sitting in his chair, reading, while Rusty dozed on the rug at his feet. Suddenly, a new sound reached him, unlike anything he had heard before. A deep, vibrating, rumbling hum. A purr. It was louder than the ticking of all the clocks combined, and it filled the room not with time, but with life. The culmination came on the evening of the third day. A gentle rain was tapping against the window panes. Arthur, as usual, sat in his chair under the green-shaded lamp. Rusty, having finished his dinner, approached the chair. He looked up at the old man, then leaped lightly onto the armrest. Arthur froze, afraid to breathe. And then the cat did something Arthur hadn't dared to expect. He stepped slowly, almost ceremoniously, onto his lap, kneaded for a moment to get comfortable, and curled into a ball. His warmth, through the thin fabric of Arthur's trousers, was a jolt. He lowered his book. A single, spare tear rolled down his wrinkled cheek. It fell onto the page, blurring the ink. His hand, the one that had so decisively saved a life, now came to rest, timidly, with infinite tenderness, on the rusty fur, feeling its incredible warmth and softness for the very first time. In response, Rusty purred even louder. From that day on, the closed sign hung more often on the door of the antique shop. The world outside could continue to roar ahead. Inside, time flowed according to its own laws. It was no longer measured by the chiming of antique clocks, but by the rhythm of a quiet purr. The antique shop of Arthur Pendleton was still home to the ghosts of the past, but now they had a living, warm guardian, and the old antique dealer was never alone again.